Really excited to have a very important conversation today with Wes Geisenberger. He is the VP of Sustainability at the Hedera Foundation. This one matters. The COP30 Global Climate Conference just brought together nearly every country on Earth, has shifted from talking about climate commitments to actually implementing change. There's a lot to get into here. Hedera hosted the Regenerative Finance Forum at that event this year, and Wes is here with us to break down all things sustainability across the globe and what's going on with Hedera as well. Wes, thank you so much for joining today. I mean, I guess to start with here, I think we've probably done a couple of interviews, but they might have been like a very long time ago. If you could maybe reintroduce yourself for the audience, talk about what you do, that'd be fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me, and happy to do so. So I'm Wes Geisenberger. I help lead sustainability at the Hedera Foundation and work with a multitude of entities across the Hedera ecosystem. Generally, folks probably know me and the Hedera Foundation from a climate sustainability perspective in creating this open source tool and digital public infrastructure, digital public goods. The most famous, that we have is the Hedera Guardian. One of the really cool things about Hedera is we spend a lot of time and effort and energy on digital public infrastructure. You probably have heard about our efforts in Asset Tokenization Studio. The Hedera Guardian is another one of these studios, but we're actually coming out with a series of studios that is what we really call them is an accelerator. And it helps you build new applications faster so you don't have to think of the backend infrastructure. And the Hedera Guardian, from a climate perspective, is known for creating this very large library. It's actually the world's largest library of digitized and open source methodologies. And so when we're going to COP and to different areas, of the world, when we're working with different applications, working with a set of investors, Hedera is actually really known for creating data integrity solutions, financial integrity solutions. And my goal, oftentimes working with these folks, is helping them build their ecosystem, build the solutions that are actually addressing the climate crisis, energy infrastructure, resilience, water infrastructure, markets, in addition to carbon credits and emissions reporting. I've been working on this since 2019, and we open sourced the Hedera Guardian in 2021. And since then, that's gone from an alpha to a beta, and now used at the world's largest independent crediting standard from a carbon perspective, Verra. And we've seen a lot of success with institutional adoption in these open source tools because it helps companies and organizations build to meet their needs, address problems, and meet some of the promises of Web3 for enterprise and institutional adoption.
And I think that leads us into COP30. If you could, talk about what that is, who attends, and why it matters for global climate action.
So COP is a really interesting event. It's a little different than any other event that you would consider a Web3 event. I would argue it's the only event that's really not a Web3 event that talks about blockchain in the mainstream. And the opportunity for blockchain and traceability is it's solving coordination problems. From a COP perspective, most of the countries, most of the organizations are there around the negotiation. But at the same time, when you have ministries of the environment, ministries of finance, different energy ministries in countries from all around the world, what you get is both the main event from a negotiating perspective and a series of side events where we're having conversations about the infrastructure needed to implement changes. COP, which stands for Conference of the Parties, is a series of events. So there's one focused on climate change run by the UNFCCC, which is the UN Climate Change Division, but there's a series of others run by the UN Environmental Program, UNDP Development Program, focusing on different topics, biodiversity, desertification, things like that. But this one was the UN Climate Change Conference, known as COP30, and next year will be COP31 in Turkey. This year it was in Belém, Brazil. And you have 190 something countries that are working together. Not every single one attends, but most of them are attending, where they send the delegates and different stakeholders from their country to participate in these events and both learn about different solutions and negotiate on what the future is going to be. So you have different topics that are called adaptation finance, mitigation. Adaptation means how are we going to adjust to some of the changes related to climate change. Mitigation finance, how are we going to reduce our emissions or the equivalent. So you may say, well, what do those emissions look like? You have carbon or methane, things that are polluting our planet. There's even different treaties in different COPs, like plastic negotiation treaty, running in parallel through a different conference around the world. But this specific COP was focused on the COP of implementation. And what that really means is the countries want to build solutions, both in their country, but also at a financial level to address the worst impacts of climate change. And a lot of times that means regulatory solutions. What am I going to do in a legal perspective for reporting and disclosure? How am I going to build markets to address my emissions? Am I going to go buy carbon credits internationally in what's called an ITMO, or an international transfer of a mitigation outcome? Am I going to build an exchange internally from a country perspective when I report my emissions? Am I going to buy some of these credits? Am I going to buy an allocation from another company that has already addressed this work in my domestic scenario? These are all different options and opportunities, but there's much beyond the carbon markets that it's done to make sure that the financial goals from both the public sector and private sector align nationally in the given country and internationally, transferring different mitigation activities or adaptation finance to countries sometimes in the global south are most affected by climate impacts, by the countries oftentimes who have the financial means to do so, or have taken a lot of benefits from past developments that have led to some of the climate impacts that have happened around the world.
So I think you mentioned something interesting before, is that you have all of these have all these nations coming together to kind of agree on certain standards, and then you also kind of get down to the granular level, and they're all tackling solutions, it sounds like, in a little bit of different ways, because it makes sense, because I'm sure they all have problems that are just a little bit different from one another depending where they're at, from a geography standpoint or from a legal standpoint or whatever. So, and then you mentioned earlier, you look at like services on Hedera as more of an accelerator. So that's got to be pretty interesting, because at the end of the day, like, we have to get this technology to a point that anybody, any jurisdiction, any government, any entity, any nation state can come on and be like, okay, we want to use this for X, Y, and Z because those are the needs that we have. So can you talk a little bit about what Hedera's presence is like at an event like that and some of the conversations that you do have with some of these, obviously very important people from very important places all across the world?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And a lot of times at events like COP, what we're doing is we're bringing a series of applications, a series of aligned investors, countries, and their stakeholders together to allow for the intersection of what they call digital innovation. Oftentimes from us, it's Web3, sometimes AI-driven innovation into the process. And so we both host a full-day event called the Regenerative Finance Forum. We have a space inside the Blue Zone, which is the area where a lot of the delegates and negotiators and key stakeholders are, called the Digital Innovation Pavilion, which actually we help support, but it was started back in 2017 by a company called EverCity, as well as the Climate Chain Coalition, so a blockchain-based coalition that partnered with the UNFCCC to make this space available. And we help curate a series of events across that pavilion. Others, we also sponsor and support AIDA, the International Emissions Trading Association, which is where a lot of the business stakeholders who come to the COP have their events. And so by supporting these three areas, we allow for a full day showcase and a series of showcases on topics relevant to the COP, in addition to engaging with businesses. And what we're generally talking about is the new innovations that have happened from what the COP calls the private sector. But it's really a lot of the startup innovators and ecosystem who've been building for the last 3-5 years on Hedera, and they've been using these accelerators to get ahead and make tangible progress. So some of the topics that really matter, for example, are country-based markets. How does a given country enable, not just carbon markets, but everything from water markets to, not just think about climate related carbon emissions related activities, but you want to have water conservation. You want to have biodiversity and nature conservation. That's a really big topic at this year's COP, given the location in Belém, Brazil, right in the mouth of the Amazon. The opportunity, though, is to show what is the example that's happening where institutional adoption is leading to success. So one of the big announcements that came from our ecosystem was the country of Uganda adopted a platform called Pearl Carbon, which is based on one of our grantees, EverCity, who uses the Hedera Guardian. Now, how does that all relate to public ledgers? One of the biggest problems for a country, like Uganda, is helping their projects, which are mitigation activities, folks planting trees, folks doing sustainable development in different ways, to get their solutions to be financially ready for markets so that they can produce a credit that can be sold to other countries. That's one of the big issues. But oftentimes when somebody says, hey, I'm going to go plant a forest, they don't have a business model that's real tight behind it. They don't have a cash flow model. They don't have access to capital markets. Those aren't necessarily Web3 problems, but the first thing that a company says when they say, hey, I need access to finances, show me how you're going to make money. Well, if you can't prove that you're following a methodology that are the business rules of how you get to market, that may be a problem. If you can't prove that every single data point is true and who said what when, that may be a problem. And if you can't prove that this credit has gone through the correct calculations, the audits, the checks, that's a data integrity problem tied to a coordination problem. And we start to get into really good Web3 blockchain problems that Hedera has been focusing on addressing for now the last half decade. And so when a country like Uganda says, well, I'm going to be using a public ledger and blockchain solutions, and Evercity can bring them access to the market, help them financially structure access methodologies, tie into independent crediting standards of the world so that their projects have a path to market. All of a sudden, we're bringing together the data integrity and the finance layer that provides a really nice solution for our country to say, hey, every project developer, you can come to me. We're going to help you access a platform that's going to teach you the way to get X, Y, and Z information and provide a path to get there. And we're able to build, it's in the COP process, it's called building capacity, but it's ultimately guiding folks to the market in a way that's a bit more structured than it would be in the past.
So one thing that I think is interesting, and I was just looking through some of your posts on here and I'll share here before we end. Make sure you guys follow, for those watching, Wes on X at Geisenberger Wes. But when you talk about this blue zone and the area that you guys had access to, you thank those that hosted you guys, and one of those is KPMG, and it stands out to me because like KPMG, PwC or PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I want to say Deloitte, all of these entities are kind of using Hedera solutions for sustainability or things that tie into sustainability. And I think maybe some product track and trace as well there, but you could allude some of the solutions that they're using for product track and trace, I'm sure, through the sustainability lens too. What type of a role do those solutions integrators play? I mean, they're some of the biggest professional services networks in the world, and they kind of sit in the middle between the problem, which is, what some of these businesses and entities and countries have, and the technical layer, which is, those in the know within technical solutions and knowing that technical solutions exist. But what is that like? What are those types of interactions like? How does a country like Uganda find out about a platform like Evercity that it uses? You get where I'm going with it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to break it kind of into two areas. I'm going to actually address the Uganda question first, and then I'll hop over to some of the big professional services firms and auditors. So we generally work with different associations around the world. You'll see that the Hedera Foundation was actually in East Africa earlier this year, and Kenya at the East African Carbon Markets Forum. We've been in West Africa multiple times, particularly in Senegal, at the West Africa Carbon Markets Hub this year. But in the past, we've been to the same event in 2023 in Cote d'Ivoire, in addition to a few other countries around Africa. Actually, we were with Deloitte in South Africa for the UN Systemic Innovation Workshop in 2024, I believe. And so these trips that we make, are to help educate. And what we ended up doing, over the last, few years is build a network. And we're not the only ones going. At the Hedera Foundation, it's our ecosystem, is working on the ground, working with carbon project developers. And so if you say, well, what is a carbon project? It's oftentimes a group of people, a community, working with a consultant. They're called a project developer. And they're working with sometimes their local government, sometimes an international consultant, an auditor like a KPMG or Deloitte, but in this case, they're specialized ones for the carbon markets. Although Deloitte is formally, they have an entity that does just that. And what they're doing is they're working under a standard to issue credits. A lot of times this standard-based process is really hard to follow. And with Uganda, they said, we need to find a way to access the international carbon market. And when they went to go look for solutions, they found Evercity, who's been in this process since 2017. And so that's, just one example of how that time, effort, and energy through both our granting programs has helped a company accelerate to the point where a government says this is the right platform for me. And we're really proud of EverCity. We're really happy about their success. But they're part of a much larger community that can take someone from a project idea all the way through to methodological adoption. You have other applications like Stratos, formerly known as Alcott.io, who are supporting a multitude of projects, going through measurement, reporting to a given standard, verification by they have a verification report done by an auditor, which then the standard looks at and says it's correct and allows issuance of the credits, which is when those projects oftentimes get paid or are able to sell them in the market. Now I want to flip over to those big names you said before. Deloitte, who has a live platform called the ESI platform, the Environmental Social Impact Platform, using the Hedera Guardian. You mentioned the PwC announcement. I want to give a big congratulations to both the PwC team as well as the Hashgraph group and association for helping get that off the ground. I know that Kamal and team have been working really hard on that partnership for a long time. But all of these companies, including KPMG, who hosted us along with the Singapore government pavilion, they don't just provide professional services. They're interestingly enough, they're an auditor for a lot of the regulatory disclosures that have to happen in given countries. So when a country passes a law, or say the state of California passes a law on what needs to be disclosed related to, say, a product carbon footprint or a company emissions profile, they go turn to these auditors. And the audit business is siloed and separate from their software consulting implementation business. And what they're doing is they're saying, well, did I faithfully follow the methodology that's supposed to be used in collecting this information? In the past, that could be a little bit more lax, a little bit more estimated. Now, most of the companies are moving to what's called a limited assurance regime. And eventually, in some of the laws and regulations, there will be something called reasonable assurance. It's really just a way to say, am I following the data integrity and the audit trail procedures for collecting information? Am I following the right methodologies that applied the correct way? And is the data that I'm providing you following that? The cool thing is, if you have an auditor, they're able to check this, and they're going to be looking for software. Ironically, the same firm, they can't work with the same company that's getting audited. They'll have a separate implementation partner. So you may have many situations where you have Deloitte as your, say, software implementer and KPMG as your auditor, or vice versa, or PwC in the same role. Now, the beauty of what we do in the Hedera Guardian ecosystem is if the methodology is on the public ledger, that's using our Hedera consensus service to help govern the data and audit trail. You have different parties using decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials using a different Hedera consensus service or HCS audit trail that are cryptographically bound to a token, which, reading the calculation engine that is in that methodology, the data that's collected and goes through that, we're actually preparing structured data to issue a set of tokens. And those tokens are then managed via smart contracts on Hedera, which allows you to programmatically manage them, use the native services, so you get cheap, predictable, fees for issuance. Then you have data governance and data integrity the whole way through. And if anything breaks or data is manipulated, we'll be able to see, because it's actually in state on the Hedera network, that information is logged in what's called a verifiable presentation, which rolls up credentials and identifiers on HCS. Hedera Guardian really is a structuring layer for any set of business rules, but it's really good at the complicated ones where multiple parties are involved. And so if you have a software company like a KPMG who has to help a company implement a piece of software to manage business rules, and you have thousands of parties involved in collecting that information, it's going to be really hard to track and prove that you tracked it appropriately in just a database. What's really nice is that the rules are on the public ledger. So if you're going to go pass this information downward or to a regulator, you can prove the information or the rules were collected under this. You can prove who said what when in terms of attesting to that information, whether it's a subsidiary company or the actual company itself, all the way through to the issuance of, here's my direct emissions, my indirect emissions, here's my product carbon footprints. All could be different methodologies that are interrelated. It's a really nice problem if you're selling consulting services, but you still need a way to coordinate it. And that's the beauty of what the Hedera Guardian provides, is when you have to disclose this information, it can help govern the data and get to a trusted unit of issuance that then is reported to a given regulatory body, oftentimes which is issued by regulation, or is created by regulation within a country, that prescribes specific information to be disclosed.
I think it's interesting because, especially given kind of where we're headed with just how sophisticated, even in the past couple of years. I mean, artificial intelligence has been around for decades, but since the Chat GPT moment, it seems like there's just more progress and more progress, and let alone how difficult it is to try to figure out what's real and what's not real. We've heard historically that like the sustainability industry, at least through my interviews, has had a lot of issues as far as determining what's real and what's not real. And networks like Hedera certainly, and network services that allow for that to kind of really just be kind of all there in front of these entities kind of eyes, I think is huge. I want to ask you, because I think it's kind of a in the same vein. We're kind of at a point with like blockchain and distributed ledger, at least in my opinion, it's totally my opinion, where we're starting to see some like not just generalized all purpose things coming out of every blockchain. And we're almost like seeing, I don't even want to say niche because it's not the right word. I'll say like specific use cases seem to be emerging from specific networks, that they're almost like specialties. And I've always thought this about Hedera, a couple of different things. I think number one, that having network services be the ability to be segmented in the architecture, where you can use Hedera Consensus if you want, or Hedera Token Service if you want, or the Hedera Guardian or the AI Studio or whatever, and having all this stuff kind of almost like a sandbox. But number two, I think, and I want to ask you, because you're in this field, through the like from a sustainability lens, is there really anything out there that can compete or that is competing with Hedera at the network level for what can be done with enterprise and with nation states and governments from a sustainability standpoint comparative to Hedera?
So what I'll say is, when we started, what was the Sustainable Impact Fund, when we launched the foundation, our goal was not to build something that's already been built 3 times. Our goal was to build solutions that only Hedera could address. And the beauty of the Hedera Guardian is it is a solution that uniquely addresses a problem that we don't believe anyone else has solved. Methodology digitization is hard. Methodology digitizations, as these methodologies evolve and change, is harder. You can't do it with an EVM smart contract. You have to be able to understand the logs and iterations and changes in every single attestation from many different parties, folks who are not necessarily Web3 natives. You have to make it work in a predictable way for the businesses. You have to be able to make it work for the individuals who are participating in a project and oftentimes are becoming new digital users previously that were operating on PDF, and if they're more advanced, in Excel sheets. So when we work in the market, and we try to address problems that haven't been addressed before, we're going to take time to evolve. But Hedera has become the leader in a market that really needed to get to the bottom of a data integrity problem, a methodology digitization problem, because it can't be tokenization first. It has to be audit trail first, being able to discover information and then get to the unit of balance, which is where our planet's balance sheet comes from. It doesn't matter if you're measuring carbon emissions, looking at carbon credits. They each have their own coordination difficulties, and that extends to biodiversity markets, water rights markets. And those are the types of problems that we've found that Hedera is really, really good at. We don't see a lot of other folks able to even think about competing in this space unless they restructured their entire network to be like Hedera. And that's the beauty of what we do in sustainability, is we've found an area that we think that we aren't just going to be the market leader, we believe we are. And we believe that this market is very unique because it doesn't just help predict Hedera network revenue or predict Hedera fees. That's not the focus. The focus is solving the business outcome. Yeah, it does those things, but it also at the same time helps grow markets so we can access institutional finance because we have better, time to market predictions because we understand what the workflow looks like. We can tie this into capital markets because we understand that both the debt units, they're called carbon forwards, in addition to carbon credits, are redeemable one for one, and we can build a cash flow model based on completing stages and steps of a carbon project. We can tie that back to what the market actually looks like, and we can build an entire market around a segment that is now trust-based rather than marketing-based. It doesn't just have to be, a marketing-driven kind of a conservation fundraising approach, it can actually be much more than that. It can be a data-driven product focused on the data integrity that more aligns with how the business world works today in project finance. We're really excited about that. And we think we're very unique in being able to create these types of outcomes.
I think it's really interesting, and it's a great point because I think a lot of the times in Web3, blockchain, and DLT, just naturally, because there's so much innovation happening everywhere, naturally it seems to be this like recycled ideas, like let's do what they're doing. And I think that I kind of agree with you. One thing that stands out to me certainly in Hedera is all the stuff going on through the sustainability lens. Certainly artificial intelligence. I think there's a lot of things you could probably argue for there, but we're not talking about that today. And a couple other aspects. And you also nail out, which I think is a really valid point. You know, we hear all the time now, especially over the past 12 to 18 months, everything's going to be tokenized. And it's like, that's not just going to happen just for the sake of tokenizing things. Things are only going to be tokenized for a reason. Like, what's the purpose of tokenizing it? But before you do that, you have to nail out the compliance portion of it, which deals pretty much directly in like digital identity of it. Like, what is the actual identity? How do you verify that identity? What is it? Where is it? When is it? All that stuff. So it's really interesting. I want to ask you, because I kind of like zoom out and I'm just thinking, and you bring it up, you're like, some of these entities and companies out there that need to digitize and have this level of auditability and transparency are still, you know, operating on hand signed piece of paper or PDFs or Excel sheets or whatever. I think it's a really valid point. I worked in the like aluminum and steel industry, and I remember that we always used to do stuff based on emissions. And they're like calculations coming from engineering. If you build something a certain way, you're going to have this level of emissions. And it's like, okay, but how do you verify that? I feel like we're at this point in humanity where we have so many different things converging at once. I guess for me, the question, I'm finally going to get to the question. Like, through sustainability, which is going to have so many impacts and everything, like, what is the opportunity here? What type of a world do you think we're going to be in, let's say, 2 decades? Because it's not going to happen immediately, but in a couple of decades, I think we'll have some measurable things to look at. And really, I guess the question I have is, how do you measure tangible results? Because it seems like a lot of the stuff we're talking about is going to streamline processes, is going to add auditability and transparency and verification. And it's almost like going to create new business models. So like, what does that tangibly look like? And because you can't, it's like intangible right now, but what to you do you think that looks like in a couple of decades tangibly? That's such a crazy question. Sorry.
Well, I think you kind of nailed it on the head though with one word, and it's process. Everything that you build has a process, whether you're cooking, in your house with a recipe, right? And when you're building a product, that methodology, it's kind of your cookbook. What the Guardian is really good at, what Hedera has become, is a master of process, defining that process. And you can extrapolate that to all sorts of things beyond sustainability. But when you digitize a methodology, what you're actually doing is governing every path and way you can build something. And you can define who's participating in that process. So from a sustainability perspective, a lot of the goods that are imported into Europe, we're going to go through this process of recording data. That process of recording data, it'll be reported under a regulation called CBAM. So the cross-border adjustment mechanism. It means you need to know all the data that goes into a specific good, how it was created, what is the emissions intensity, but you're going to need to know a lot more. There's different regulations on digital product passport, which requires process. You're going to know that there's no slave labor, and maybe it's your phone, maybe it's your computer, or any other type of device. Sustainability doesn't just touch an emissions profile. It touches everything from water to other elements that are regulated. And I'd argue that what we're doing on Hedera doesn't just apply to sustainability with our open source infrastructure. It applies to markets. It applies to data integrity and supply chain, which I know we talked a little bit about or alluded to before. And when we think about how we get started in these markets, is we find the markets that really need help from a data integrity perspective, that need the governance on what is a methodology. Methodologies are going to be defined by the scientific community. That's not my job. That's not Hedera's job. But our job is to build extensible open source infrastructure that can expand to specific markets, to different contexts, whether it's, what we're working on where Vera is using our tools one way, we have entire water markets that are going to work in mitigation banking activities where you say, well, if you're going to build a building in one place, you need to do, maybe you need to buy a stream credit, and that credit could be used to, in this case in the US, it's used in a specific context to enable the same watershed to have better improvement as defined by the laws. For example, in the state of Virginia, where one of our projects is in the ecosystem. Those types of outcomes are going to be totally different. Those, for example, a stream credit or a nutrient credit will be totally different than a carbon credit coming from Vera, which will be totally different than an emissions calculation or a product carbon footprint calculation. But if we can make our infrastructure extensible to support all these types of business outcomes, Hedera is going to scale in all types of ways that maybe public ledgers haven't seen before.
I think it's interesting too because you mentioned from the process standpoint, there's still processes right now, like in supply chain even, which is certainly going to touch on to sustainability because you're going to have to be able to track and trace where these products came from. But there's still processes right now that are finally getting modernized in 2025. I mean, there's nations quite literally that have hand signed bill of ladings as a process, which is like the late 1800s, I think. I think the UK just passed a digital document law in 2023, I want to say. So I mean, this is the type of stuff that we're just starting to see. I mean, one area that I think that this all kind of leads us into is this kind of almost like participation economy in a way. Um, and just maybe I would love if you could just briefly touch on, where you think sustainability connects into our ability to participate more in sustainability. Like it's almost like I alluded to, like you go to the doctor and the doctor's like, do you do this and this? Oh, you shouldn't do that. That's not healthy. And people are like, well, I'm not going to listen because I'm not incentivized to listen. But what do you think that is going to happen in the future with our ability to participate in sustainability and some of the other things that might happen, off the back end of that?
Yeah, so I'd say that there's a few ways to think about it. There's always the top-down way where governments are going to say, well, you can't have, say, hazardous material imported into a country. There's all sorts of things that you maybe can't use. But I would argue that from a participation perspective, it's going to incentivize folks to disclose more. I think that a lot of the goods and services that we have, and if you look at how Europe's done it for even food-related disclosures, it's going to kind of be looking at the ingredients on the side of your cereal box. There's certain things that maybe the government won't allow, but from a participation perspective, you're going to have much more say if you know what's inside, this item or this good or this service that went into it. I would also argue that it gives better clarity to participate. And from a sustainability perspective, a lot of times we don't necessarily know all the pros and cons of using a good or a service. In certain states in the US, like California, there's a lot more disclosure. In Europe, the food, maybe doesn't have some high fructose corn syrup is kind of the most obvious angle to think about it. But we know how to participate by using our voice and saying, well, maybe we want to be more like Europe and be a little bit healthier and not, have all this processed material in our food, or maybe we want to be more like the U.S. and allow anything to go in our food to some degree, like the high fructose corn syrup. I would argue, though, that on a sustainability perspective, it makes everything easier to understand when that process is defined. And if that process is defined, we know how to access the market, how to produce goods and services. We know what roles we can play because they're kind of predefined. It's kind of an on-ramp and not just a cookbook like the recipes we talked about. It's also an ability to say, well, how should this change? How do I innovate on the process? How do I make it more efficient? And from a participatory economy, you don't just have to be building a system. There's going to be very few people in the world relative to the global population. There'll be systems builders, but there's certainly going to be folks who participate in the gig economy, right?
Yeah.
How do we operate before Uber? We tried to find a taxi and there were just medallions. Now in the Uber economy, a lot of folks can sign up and become a driver a lot more easily. I'd argue for people providing goods and services, the on-ramp to participating is going to be a little bit clearer on what that looks like. And I think hopefully it'll be easier, just like signing up to become an Uber driver or calling an Uber as an example. And I'm not sure if it totally answers your question, but if that process is clear, it should be a gateway and an on-ramp.
I think what's really interesting is where blockchain and distributed ledger really opens things up is I mean, even think about like, okay, from the most, a lot of us have worked in like businesses, and like if there's a breakdown in communication and you don't understand what your boss is asking you, or you don't understand what your coworker is or what the task is, then normally stuff starts going wrong. And it's almost like throughout the world, at least with all these interviews, I've learned that there is a massive breakdown in communication, like with a lot of systems, a lot of companies and everything else, where I think blockchain and DLT really opens that up. Is it just naturally is going to shine a light on things. And it's going to do that naturally, even in private instances of blockchain and DLT. These companies are going to have way more insight into their operations than they've ever had. So like one example that I think is interesting is I was in the military, and the amount of food that we would waste like on a daily basis could have probably like literally fed like hundreds of homeless people on a monthly basis. And it's not by intent. There's nothing like inherently bad about like over ordering food and stuff like that. It's just you can kind of rip you can kind of address that root problem and be like, well, why did we order that much in the first place? We have the data that shows us that we don't need that much. And it's like it just is going to change all of these processes, I think, and that's going to be pretty interesting. It was an example that was brought up to me a while ago too, about like just all the excess energy that we use and how it goes back to your energy company, your electric company, whatever it is, and then they get whatever benefit they get from it. Um, but we're kind of kept out of that value loop right now, and I think that will change as well. All right, I'm rambling because I love this topic, and it's a topic that I don't get to talk about as much. But when you think about the next, it seems like from like a, let's say, like carbon footprint standpoint, that there was these like benchmark years. 2025 was one, 2030 was one. I think if my memory serves, 2050 is one. And from reading about COP30, it seems like there's some things put in place to like stop talking about solutions, but start implementing some of the solutions. What does that look like? Like, what is 2030? What is 2040? Like, what are some of the goals to operationalize the tech and really make some meaningful change?
I would say like in implementation, there's a lot of different categories. And it means a lot of different things to different parties. So to the financiers, implementation, it doesn't just mean investments. It could be issuing access to structured finance. From a country perspective, it could be investing in a series of topics in a given country. It could be investing in communities in the global south. There's a topic called the just transition that's a really big topic about enabling communities in developing countries. And that's allowing them to access certain types of finance to go through the same sustainable development steps that global north countries have gone through. The just energy transition is talking about the transition away from fossil fuels into renewables in a way that doesn't just transition to renewables, but does so in an equitable way. It doesn't punish the communities that are operating on coal or in energy rich countries in the sense of oil, natural gas, so on and so forth. Those types of concepts all mean different things to different parties. And so when we say, well, what types of investments are out there, there's this new collective quantified goal, so the NCQG, which was agreed on in COP29 in Baku, which was 300 billion of finance, was going to be allocated for, and then up to 1.3 trillion was going to be the goal. This year there was a new agreement on funding going into adaptation finance for 1.3 trillion. But what it's going to really mean is still going to be determined at a country by country level. There's going to be specific investments by financial institutions in given countries. Governments are not just going to be investing domestically, but also abroad. We heard Australia made a prediction that by 2035, they were going to have potentially be on 90% of renewable energy. From a country perspective, some countries are already working their way towards 100% renewable energy. And so it really is going to mean things very differently to different parties. When you say, well, what's the government of Uganda doing? They're allowing their projects to get access to institutional finance because they're investing in a platform like ProCarbon and Evercity. But that's going to surface in many different ways at both the international level, where development finance institutions are going to be investing in specific projects. The World Bank, the IMF will have their specific initiatives. focused on developing countries oftentimes, but also financing everything from renewables to water conservation to totally different types of areas in capacity building and economic development. So it really will depend.
I've seen definitely, you know, one thing that's really been, and for those that are interested in Uganda's the platform they're utilizing, procarbon.africa. One thing that I've seen that is seems to it's not like a trend, it's just like happening, is when you look at some of these kind of areas like Africa, India, kind of some of these emerging, and I do say emerging because I mean emerging. I think that they are literally taking distributed ledger and blockchain very seriously at the builder level and just coming in and being like, you know what, we're going to innovate. And it's been really interesting to watch on the back end of a lot of these hackathons, what some of the stuff that has been built. So I'm really excited there. What's next for you? I know, Wes, you're kind of a globetrotter here, but what is next as far as, are you heading anywhere in particular? Obviously, we're coming up on the holiday season here, but whether it be the work through the Hedera Foundation, do climate tech and sustainability, or travel, what's coming down the pipeline? What are you excited about?
So I'll talk on the foundation front. We have spent a lot of time over the last year connecting our studios and accelerators. So we're happy to, one of the things we talked about at COP was connecting asset tokenization studio for debt instruments like bonds and different types of securities or equities to the Hedera Guardian. So looking at those debt instruments, how do we trace the flow of funds and stablecoins to the same accounts that are testing data to achieve a unit of impact, whether it's carbon, a carbon credit or another type of biodiversity unit. That's the thing that we've been spending a ton of time, money, and effort on to make this infrastructure connect to institutional financial markets. So we've been working a lot on that topic. And now we also have another open source tool or an accelerator called the National Carbon Registry. It was actually started by the UNDP. This digital public good national carbon registry or carbon registry solution is kind of helping us get full circle from issuance of a credit to managing methodologies to now debt and capital markets and financial flows. So we're actually bringing together 4 different studios that we have in the Hedera ecosystem, all focused on sustainability. And some of them have multiple purposes, like Asset Tokenization Studio, not specifically sustainability, but the fact that we're actually able to follow flow of funds through unit of issuance for a given country registry. It opens us up to markets to be full cycle digital plumbing to enable financial integrity and data integrity. Now, these types of tools aren't going to be used end to end everywhere, but it allows us to access the international carbon markets for both governments as well as the independent crediting standards. It allows us to build on our success in the world's largest methodology library that's digitized and open source, and allows us to access these big financial instruments. Sometimes bonds go everywhere from 50, 100 million to multi-billion dollars, but the big problem they have is, how do I follow my funds to a proven impact tied to a methodology that's independently verified in a country that's issuing an asset? And that asset may not just be a carbon credit, it may be all other types of outcomes. You know, I'm super excited about what we're able to create. And we kind of have a playbook that we've been able to test and get success with the Hedera Guardian. But now expanding that to both the capital markets and government infrastructure is something that I think is a really big opportunity for Hedera, a really big opportunity also for these governments and financial institutions to leverage blockchain and public ledgers to their full potential. And so that's where I see our future going from a sustainable impact perspective. But I also think it provides a roadmap for any other group in capital markets and financial markets to prove the impact of those funds to a specific outcome that they're looking to achieve.
Now, let me ask you, because you mentioned something pretty interesting, and we won't go too deep down the rabbit hole here, but when you look at some of the tokenization estimates from some of these entities, and they are like, they range very widely. I mean, you have entities saying a few trillion will be tokenized, and you have, up to 30 trillion by 2030. But what's interesting there is, if you look at that right now, I think it's probably around 40 billion or so, excluding stable coins, 40 or whatever. That is like kind of the normal financial assets out there in the wild. I mean, we see stocks, bonds, all that type of stuff. You know, this whole conversation really sparks my interest as far as what, through the sustainability lens, what types of sustainability assets can potentially be tokenized. Does
Mhm.
anybody else even have the level of kind of sophistication required to be able to do something like that? Like, is that assumption that I'm making, like out there in the wild, there's a lot of things from a real world asset standpoint being tokenized that aren't the low hanging fruit things that actually do take a lot of work to get towards. But if you can get into that area, it becomes really interesting because that's an area that hasn't really even been tapped into yet from the traditional standpoint.
Yeah, and I'd argue, you know, in terms of the naming conventions, the real world is the farmers. The real world is the folks who are working everyday jobs, whether it's managing water. You know, water conservation is also just water efficiency. You know, you look at the state of California, and they have, they're managing a scarce resource, right? Does it go to the city of LA? Does it go to, the farmers farming almonds or other crops in the Central Valley? That problem happens everywhere around the world, and our planet needs a balance sheet to manage our resources. It doesn't matter if the resource is water, if it's energy, if it's measuring pollutants, plastics, carbon emissions, credits, biodiversity units, right? These are all different things that are natural capital. And what makes it real? It's proving that this information happened somewhere, and who said what when, whether it's a sensor, a person, or a system. We may want to know how it was financed. The financier certainly wants to know that money is going towards a farm instead of a Lamborghini. I guarantee you that. And at the same time, when we think of the concept of RWAs, I'd argue that it's what's happening on the ground is what makes it real. And so as we think about what the future is, there's a dollar amount, there's a unit of outcome amount. I certainly believe both the dollars and the units of outcome, whether their carbon credits or something else, will be tokenized. And it may not be a stable coin. Maybe it's a deposit token, like we've seen with some of the big banks, or maybe it's another type of currency. But those types of things, I think, are all going to be part of the mix. And I can't tell you the number. I don't have an ability to quantify it. There's folks a lot smarter than me thinking about the overall market size, but I can tell you it's big, and I can tell you that when you start to add things up, when bonds are $100 million dollars to $1 billion a pop in some cases, and they're funding dozens of projects, and those projects are touching dozens of communities that are leading, in our case, sometimes to millions or tens of millions or sometimes hundreds of millions of carbon credits, depending on the size. All those things can be tokenized, and that doesn't even get into the debt. The debt relation to that tokenization that could also be tokenized. Um, in the case of carbon emissions, those are a corresponding unit which could also be tokenized, both at a product carbon footprint level, in addition to an organizational level, in addition to what's disclosed nationally. And when you start to build that out, and you say everything's going to be tokenized, I want to go back to your question of why. Only when you can prove the data behind it, the financing behind it, is my personal belief. And the fact that we're well on our way to being able to prove that data point by data point, that's been verified in the context of a methodology, and working back towards the finance of how it was created, I think that's a pretty good why.
Yep. I definitely want to give a shout and um, make sure that people go follow Wes at Geisenberger Wes. And I didn't directly link all of the panels, but I will scroll down. You can go and check out all of the refi and the COP30 panels here from Wes's links. I just didn't want to get flagged for copyright here. But I'm sure that there's just absolutely amazing conversations. Go learn more about the Guardian at hedera.com/Guardian, Hedera.Foundation as well, and genfinity.io. We have those full length Deloitte and PwC and a lot of those other interviews that we were talking about here. Let's not do this, let's not wait as long next time to do one of these, Wes. And thank you for taking the time to walk through all of this with us today. It's really exciting. I mean, I think at the end of the day, like, I think you nailed it whenever you said, look, we can talk about basically we could talk about crypto and blockchain and DLT and all this stuff and, real world asset tokenization and everything. But at the end of the day, and I bring this up, like, I fervently believe that blockchain and DLT are going to be woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. And that's the type of impact that we definitely haven't seen yet. And I think that we are heading towards a future where that impact, maybe not everybody realizes it's happening, but their water is going to be cleaner, or maybe they're getting revenue from the electric company. like God only knows what's going to happen, but it's exciting that we're heading towards a world that things are a little bit more transparent, and there's a little bit more accountability for some of this stuff too. That being said, I know it's Thanksgiving coming up in just a couple of days, Wes. So if you and your family celebrate, definitely wanted to mention happy holiday season to you, and let's do this again next year.
Thank you so much for having me. In the spirit of Thanksgiving, I do also want to give a big shout out. There's a lot of folks who make things like COP30 possible. We've been doing it for 4 years now. Everyone from our digital innovation community at COP to the folks around the Hedera ecosystem, the foundation, exponential science, very importantly, Hashgraph, who does a lot of the technical enablement, developer advocacy, and has really been a great champion for the community in addition to Hedera itself, and the council members who are really invested in this topic. We can make a heck of a difference. And, I appreciate, the Genfinity team as well, in addition to the rest of the community, for your support. My hope is we'll get to do this again a few times next year, and we'll have some updates, sharing a few of the new outcomes that we're able to create in the spirit of implementation for COP. So thank you very much, and I really appreciate having me today.
Awesome. Thanks, Wes.
All right, cheers.